The silence in the Yamaha garage during the Valencia post-season test was louder than the screaming engines on the front straight. For over 2 decades, the Iwata factory had clung to a philosophy that defined them, the Inline-4 engine. It was smooth, it was precise, and it had carried legends like Valentino Rossi and Jorge Lorenzo to the pinnacle of the world. But as Fabio Quartararo stepped off his M1 and pulled his helmet off, the look in his eyes told a different story. The trapped king of MotoGP was out of patience. Yamaha had reached a dead end. In a world now dominated by the brutal acceleration and aerodynamic complexity of European V4 machines, the Japanese giant was fighting a war with outdated weapons. Behind closed doors, a seismic shift was already in motion. Paolo Pavesio, the man stepping into the massive shoes of Lynn Jarvis, knew that history would not save them. To survive, Yamaha didn't just need a faster bike. They needed to tear down their entire identity and rebuild it from the ground up. The stakes were no longer just about trophies. They were about keeping the greatest talent of a generation from walking out the door. But as the first blueprints of the secret V4 project began to circulate, a new question emerged in the paddock. Was this a genuine rebirth or a desperate, last-minute gamble that arrived too late to save the crown? When Paolo Pavesio took the reins of Yamaha's MotoGP project, he didn't just inherit a team, he inherited a crisis. For years, the factory had been criticized for a conservative Japanese culture that moved too slowly for the modern, high-speed era of aero wings and ride-height devices. Pavesio, coming from a background where marketing meets high-stakes competition, brought a different energy. He understood that 2026 couldn't just be a transitional season. In the world of elite racing, transition is often just a polite word for failure. Pavesio's first mission was to bridge the gap between the rigid engineering in Iwata and the aggressive, win-at-all-costs mentality of the European paddock. Reports from inside the hospitality units suggested that the atmosphere had changed. The politeness was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical realism. Pavesio's mantra was simple: 2026 must be viewed realistically. He knew the world expected an overnight miracle, but the technical mountain they had to climb was Everest. The Inline-4 was a masterpiece of balance, but the V4 was a monster of potential. Bridging those two worlds meant making decisions that would alienate traditionalists and put immense strain on the mechanics. Yet, as the new boss looked at the data, he realized they had no choice. The circle had to be closed, even if it meant breaking the foundation of the house that Rossi built. The technical rift between Yamaha and its rivals had become a chasm. While Ducati and Aprilia utilized the narrow profile of the V4 engine to create aerodynamic masterpieces, Yamaha's Inline-4 acted like a sail, catching the wind and limiting the bike's evolution. But the engine swap wasn't just about top speed. According to technical insiders, the real issue was combat usability. The old M1 was a scalpel, perfect when the track was clear, but in a pack of snarling V4s it was helpless. It couldn't overtake and it couldn't defend. The new V4 project represented a leap into the unknown. Pavesio admitted that he didn't expect the bike to be a single-lap weapon from day one. Instead, the focus shifted toward tires, electronics, and traction. The goal was to build a Yamaha that didn't lose its effectiveness when a rider had to take an imperfect line to avoid a rival. They were looking for a bike that could survive the chaos of a mid-pack brawl and emerge with its tires intact. But building a completely new engine configuration while the season is active is like trying to change the tires on a car while it's doing 200 miles per hour. The complexity of the electronics alone was enough to keep the engineers awake for weeks. Rumors began to surface that the initial bench tests were promising, but the gap between a dyno and the scorching asphalt of Sepang is where dreams go to die. At the center of this storm stands Fabio Quartararo. He is Yamaha's technical and sporting benchmark, the man who has spent 3 years dragging a subpar machine to results it never deserved. Yamaha's loyalty to Fabio is absolute. They have backed him with a record-breaking contract and the promise of a revolution. But loyalty in MotoGP has an expiration date, and it usually matches the date of the final race of the season. Fabio has often been the most reliable barometer of the Yamaha project. When he smiles, the bike is working. When he stares blankly at the monitors, the season is over. The pressure on the young Frenchman is immense. He isn't just fighting his rivals, he is fighting the ticking clock of his own career. Pavesio's primary job is to keep Fabio happy, but happiness for a world champion isn't found in a paycheck, it's found on the podium. If the V4 doesn't show signs of life by the middle of 2026, the risk of losing their star rider becomes a terrifying reality. Paddock whispers suggest that Fabio has already had informal chats with other factory heads. He wants to believe in the V4, he wants to believe in Pavesio's vision, but he cannot afford another year of finishing 10th and calling it a good day. Just as the tension reached a boiling point, Yamaha dropped a bombshell that shook the foundations of both the MotoGP and Superbike paddocks. The arrival of Toprak Razgatlioglu. The 3-time Superbike world champion isn't just another rider, he is a force of nature. Known for his stoppy entries and a level of braking aggression that defies the laws of physics, Toprak represents the other side of Yamaha's future. Pavesio had been keen to bring the Turkish star back to the Yamaha family at all costs. For Toprak, this is more than a career move, it is about closing a circle that began years ago. But the transition from superbikes to the rigid carbon-braked prototypes of MotoGP is a notoriously difficult path. Critics argued that at his age, Toprak was entering the lion's den too late. However, Pavesio remained calm. He pointed to Toprak's history of overcoming impossible odds and his exceptional instincts. The plan was clear. While Fabio provided the technical continuity, Toprak would bring the raw, unadulterated aggression. They were pairing the most refined rider on the grid with the most unpredictable one. It was a fascinating experiment, but in a year where every point mattered, was it a stroke of genius or a chaotic distraction? As the 2026 season approached, the atmosphere inside the Yamaha garage became electric. It wasn't just the new engine or the new star rider, it was the sheer weight of expectation. Toprak was coming in with all eyes on him, and Fabio was waiting with an ultimatum in his pocket. Pavesio's strategy was to lower expectations publicly while ramping them up internally. He emphasized that Toprak and the V4 would grow together, a phrase that suggested a long-term build. But MotoGP doesn't give you time to grow. The media began to circle, questioning whether Yamaha could handle two alpha personalities while simultaneously debugging a brand new engine. There were reports of garage tension during the early winter workshops. Some mechanics, longtime veterans of the Inline-4 era, were reportedly struggling with the rapid pace of change. Strategy meetings lasted late into the night. The challenge wasn't just making the bike faster, it was making it mature. Pavesio admitted that he didn't imagine the bike would be more mature than the old M1 right away. On the contrary, he expected a rough start. But in a sport where the fans demand instant results, how much roughness would the public and the riders tolerate before the narrative turned toxic? The real battle for Yamaha in 2026 isn't against Ducati, it's against the physics of the racetrack. Pavesio's most telling comment was about the front end. Yamaha has always been famous for its front-end feel, allowing riders to carry immense corner speed. The fear was that by switching to a V4 they would lose that DNA. The engineers were tasked with a near-impossible mission: keep the soul of the Yamaha while giving it the muscles of a V4. This is where the combat element comes back into play. In modern MotoGP, if you can't use a slipstream, you are dead in the water. The old M1 would overheat its front tire and lose all braking stability the moment it got close to another bike. The V4 was designed to breathe differently. It was designed to stay cool and stay stable while chasing. But as the first tests in Sepang loomed, rumors from the supply chain suggested that certain key aero components were behind schedule. The pressure shifted back to the riders. They were told to adapt, to find new ways to fight. For Fabio, this meant changing a riding style he had perfected over a decade. For Toprak, it meant unlearning the habits that made him a king in SBK. The stage was set for a season of brutal self-reinvention. While the world focused on 2026, the elite strategists in the paddock were already looking at 2027. Most of the grid would be out of contract, and a massive shift in regulations was coming. Pavesio was playing a multi-dimensional game of chess. By securing both Fabio and Toprak through to the new era, he was trying to build a fortress of stability in a sea of chaos. He stated emphatically that Yamaha is for Fabio and for Toprak. But the silly season for 2027 doesn't start in 2027, it starts the moment the lights go out for the first race of 2026. Pavesio knew that the only way to keep his stars happy was to make the bike attractive. If the V4 showed even a glimmer of dominance, Yamaha would become the most sought-after seat on the grid. If it faltered, it would become a graveyard for careers. The Italian boss remained confident, citing the circle that needed to be closed with Toprak and the renewed fire in Fabio's eyes. But confidence is a cheap currency in the paddock. The only thing that carries value is the stopwatch. As the teams packed their crates for the first round, the realization hit home: Yamaha was no longer just a participant in MotoGP. They were the lead actors in the most expensive and dangerous drama in sports. The 2026 season was never going to be easy, but no one predicted just how thin the line between success and disaster would become. Yamaha had thrown everything into the fire: their heritage, their budget, and their reputation. Pavesio had gambled on a concept, a V4 engine, and a Turkish wildcard to save a sinking ship. As the bikes lined up on the grid for the season opener, the tension was thick enough to feel. Fabio Quartararo sat on the grid, his face a mask of pure focus. Beside him, the rookie Toprak looked at the world he had fought so hard to enter. The V4 rumbled beneath them, a different sound, a different soul, a different future. Pavesio's words echoed through the garage: "We'll see." It was a simple phrase that carried the weight of a billion-dollar industry. The revolution had begun and there was no turning back. Whether this would be the greatest comeback in the history of the sport or the final chapter of a fallen empire remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the MotoGP paddock would never be the same again. Yet, as the lights began to flicker, a whisper emerged from a rival garage, a rumor that the V4 had a hidden flaw that Yamaha's engineers hadn't yet discovered, a flaw that could change everything.